Hello, and welcome to our next event, which is a lecture on Stalin. That's going to be led by Nikolai Tolstoy, who's written numerous books on the topic and is a renowned expert in this field. We hope you find it enlightening and interesting, and hope you will support us by coming to future lectures and also supporting our fundraising initiatives. Thank you very much.
I have been looking very much forward to come to this event, especially because I would, first of all, like to get better acquainted with the interesting initiatives of the new generation carrying on with the foundation. Most of the lectures that I have been attending have very often focused on the imperial times of Russia. This lecture will be very instructive in the sense of understanding better the changes in Russia before 1917 and afterward. Another objective of the foundation, of course, is to motivate the conscience of the younger generations about the history of Russia, that they should know better, respect for all ways, understand themselves better through the knowledge of history. And in that respect, I think that this series of lectures and other initiatives that have taken place are very important indeed.
Thank you everybody for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Andrei Brodzienko, one of the trustees of the Romanoff Foundation, who let's say some of the newer generation, I think still fall into that category, took over a few years back, building really on the work of Princess Dort and her late husband, Prince Dmitry Romanov. Luckily, we have Princess Dort, who's over from Copenhagen, to join us for this lecture. I think she's been very supportive of the work that we've been doing and the direction that we've taken. We've done a number of let's say, initiatives. One of them has been this kind of lecture series, and fortunately, we've had Nikolai Tolstoy join us already, not the first time, but the second time. The first one was a great success, and I think everyone will agree that I guess the content and the delivery is really first class. In terms of the foundation itself, I think some of the aims and why we look to do these lectures is really just to explore areas of Russian society generally, and this specifically being Russian history. We're also looking at culture and other events, and we're also actively filming and using videographer to film these events so then they can be shared through the internet. And I think some of the events and things we've done have been distributed quite broadly. We've also done some legacy videos, which I would say some of the older generation, again, effectively trying to capture this period of history and make sure it's preserved and recorded for the next generation. So that brings me to the topic of today's talk, which is Stalin. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the talk, in addition to the excellent lecture last year, which probably was too broad in nature, but mainly ended up focusing on, I think, Nikolai's excellent book called The Victims of Yalta, and all those victims of, let's say, former Soviet citizens and some not even Soviet citizens who got deported and sent back to the Soviet Union during the time of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. And I think with this lecture, one of the things we wanted to look into is look a bit back into history and just to try to really understand sort of, how did a man like Stalin, who probably ran the Soviet Union longer than anyone else, any other single individual, how did this transition happen from an empire to kind of cardinally turning around on its head in terms of values, beliefs, and all these things, and the effects of that transition through kind of 2 world wars, revolutions, and obviously kind of great terrors. I was told that this may be a bit of a depressing topic. I get that, I think, but at the same time, when you read the history, and I think the more you understand, the more you know, in some ways, the more it kind of unlocks things. And also, I think it's something that's owed to all the millions of victims who lived through that period and, let's say, really had the hard time. So I think, and I hope you'll find it very interesting, the format we'll take is that Nikolai will speak probably for about 20-25 minutes in terms of, say, a brief overview, and then we'll take Q&A to really try to make it interactive so people can ask specific questions about specific times and periods of history. So I don't think Nikolai needs much introduction, but as I've already said kind of through my short talk, there have been several kind of key books that Nikolai has written specifically about this time period. Victims of Yalta probably being the best known, and another one that I read recently preparing for this talk was Stalin's Secret War, which effectively talks about what Stalin was doing in the background before World War II and throughout it, and then even after. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Nikolai.
Well, Andrei very kindly brought the book that I wrote. I was rather concerned to see how long ago it was, now, nearly 40 years ago. And of course, one big handicap, which one just had to live with if you were writing about the Soviet Union at that time, was that, well, of course, there was no access to Soviet archives. And in skipping through it yesterday, I saw that I actually say, well, we may know this if ever the Soviet archives are released. Well, of course, now an enormous amount of material has been and still is being released in Russia. Absolutely fascinating. Worrying for me, because I thought, well, what if a lot of what I wrote proves to be rubbish? For most historians are writing safely about things where more or less all that can be known is available, and you're not going to get a nasty surprise. But this was something where, actually on two levels, first of all on Stalin himself, and of course we had no access, and even thought, I remember reading in the memoirs of a Soviet archivist that there were plans, in the event of the collapse of the Soviet Union, to destroy all the archives so they never would be seen. But fortunately, it happened in such a way that that didn't occur. And I've been there to work in the archives. They're extremely helpful. They're slightly unpredictable because they sometimes, under the present administration, close them. So I actually don't know what I saw, which is still available, and what isn't. But anyway, I make copies and make sure they're safely looked after, because you never know. But I remember when I went there, I was invited by, this was about the forced repatriation, which of course is part of Stalin's appalling story. There I was shown around the archives, and General Volker-Gornoff, who wrote the first biography of Stalin using the archives, of which he was in charge. And I remember I went to see him first before being taken to the different ministries to see the archives. And he paused in the course of explaining, and he just looked at me quizzically, and he said, how come the West doesn't understand what everyone in Russia knows is true? Well, of course, people were taken in a lot by Stalin, and thinking back to my own younger days, there was a huge amount of sympathy, perhaps less for Stalin, though when I was very young, there was huge support for Stalin in the war, admiration for him as a real tough who deal with Hitler. But before and after, especially in the 30s, there was appalling admiration for Stalin by people living comfortably in the West. And Bernard Shaw, for example, famously said, I don't think anyone could seriously consider Stalin as a vulgar gangster. Well, actually, that's precisely what he was. Not because of so much, but what he did after the revolution. No, that's bad enough. But the only job he ever had before the great events of 1917 was actually being a bank robber. And he was down in Georgia. He was robbing banks, allegedly to help the Communist Party, but a great deal of the money disappeared along the way. And he was very cavalier with money. Actually, thinking of that, when he was finally ruling all of Russia, he some people have written and said, he had unlimited money. He didn't actually have any money, and he barely knew. He counted in pre-revolutionary kopecks because he didn't know. He didn't need money. Whatever he wanted, he took, whether it was a huge estate or just a car. Or he wasn't interested in women. Otherwise, Liberia, no doubt he would have taken them. Now, when Stalin was a fairly obscure figure before, up to 1918, he was an unprepossessing person. He was, not that that's unprepossessing, but he was quite insignificant in appearance to all those who met him privately. He was quite short, 5 foot 2 inches tall, heavily pockmarked, and again, not his fault, of course, but he had a damaged arm, which meant he couldn't undertake military service during the Great War. Of course, had he done, as Hitler did, he might, with any luck, have been caught by a German sniper. He was quite ignorant of the world. He, funnily enough, came to London to a Bolshevik conference before, I think, in King Edward VII's time. But as he couldn't speak English, I don't think he gained very much from that. And after that, only twice, I think I'm right, when he was, during the war, when he attended the conferences in Tehran and in Berlin, Potsdam. Otherwise, he never left Russia. He was quite well read. He had a big library, but lots of people have big libraries who aren't necessarily well read. But he read voraciously in Marxist dogma and what Lenin wrote too. And he tended to believe what he read, but adapted it to his own uses. And his secretary, one of his secretaries, Boris Bajanov, who defected to the West in the 20s, he firmly said, and his daughter said much the same thing, that he used Marxist dogma as a cloak to justify even the most wicked of his misdeeds. So in that way, I always think people say, oh, well, Marx was actually a well-intentioned, scholarly guy. Lenin was rough and tough, but nevertheless, things would have been better if he'd succeeded. But actually, I think Marx, in my view, was guilty of a great deal, because he gave these people the legitimacy, or what they read for legitimacy, which justified it. And most people, high and low, need some sort of outward justification for their lives. I remember some years ago, owing to a misunderstanding, I found myself in a police cell after a beefsteaks dinner. And when I woke up in the morning feeling slightly the worse for wear, I found that my fellow, they weren't prisoners quite, but people in there, they had two things in common. They were all Irish, and they'd all been framed by the police. So you'd think they might just pinch things. One told me he had a bottle of whiskey, which a policeman crept into a supermarket, took the bottle and stuffed it in his back pocket. But that's on a lowly level. But Stalin devoured the works of Marx, and Marx too, being more of a prophet than an historian, gave that so-called legitimacy to his misdeeds. He was a devout worshipper of Lenin. In 1980, he played a very small part in the events of 1917, and incidentally, I have to remind people, especially in England, quite often, that when they talk about the revolution, well, actually there were two revolutions in 1917. I know this is obvious to anyone who's read about it. The first revolution, which wasn't really a revolution at all, except in the sense of it being a political turnabout, was when the Emperor Nicholas simply abdicated. But it didn't require, he went very quietly, and it didn't require any fighting, and there was only a revolution in the political sense of the provisional government taking over. The real revolution, which again wasn't actually, in strict terms, I don't think a revolution, but more of what the Germans call a putsch, an armed takeover by the Bolsheviks in October. And then Stalin played very little part in all this, and he really came to the fore, both as Lenin liked him and trusted him. It's said that Lenin saw through him eventually, and in his testament he describes Stalin as rude, and this was used both by communists and fellow travelers, to justify Lenin and say, well, you know, he saw through Stalin, and if he'd lived, he would have probably not have allowed him to become his successor. But actually, as Shostakovich said to someone, well, what is rude? Among Bolsheviks, it's a virtue. But in 1918, he did play quite a considerable part. A man who's, well, it's not quite a biography, but a book I'm writing where he plays the key part, Cossack General Krasnov, raised the Don Cossacks and to fight against the Bolsheviks. And in their path was the city of Tsaritsyn on the Volga. And Stalin was the chief organizer, commissar for the defense of Tsaritsyn. And after a hard-fought siege, Stalin successfully brought the city through. And for this, not only was he greatly admired by Trotsky and Lenin, but also the city itself then took his name and became Stalingrad. Now, I wish it had gone back to Tsaritsyn, but it's, I think it's named after Catherine the Great. But now it's, of course, Lee Stalin's name has vanished and it's Volgograd. Under Lenin, he raised to considerable power and influence, and he was commissar for nationalities. There was a sort of fraudulent pretense of allowing minority peoples of Russia to have autonomy. But of course, it was never the Bolshevik intention that anyone, whether a nation or a person, should have any autonomy at all. And then when Lenin was shot by the social democrat Fanny Kaplan and crippled and eventually had a series of strokes and succumbed to it, he identified Stalin as his successor. And thereafter, Stalin assumed control. For a while, he had to divide, as we all know, power with Trotsky, who eventually became his great rival. And Trotsky had been much more successful. He was commissar for war, played a key part in enabling the victory of the Reds over the Whites in the Civil War. And the book I'm writing at the moment is preparing is about this, to me, very interesting period between the wars, when most people think of, and many people here are of Russian descent, so we're white Russians. Most people think that in the war they lived lives like, as no doubt, as Prince Yusupov did, of frequenting nightclubs if they were rich enough, if they were poor nobles driving taxis in Paris, and if, as most were, very poor, then they were waiters in Paris restaurants or working in coal mines in Alsace and things like this. But they've rather been airbrushed out of history, in my view. But they weren't airbrushed out of Stalin's consciousness. And there's plenty of evidence now available. What's in particular interesting to me is that the Russians have been publishing year by year, so far 6 volumes, and only got up to 1929, of the reports by the OGPU, the predecessor of the KGB, on white activities, which clearly Stalin took very seriously indeed. In fact, though later he identified Trotsky and the alleged Trotskyites as the biggest adversaries plotting against the revolution, he feared the whites much more. Now, this was perfectly understandable. After all, we don't know exactly, but it's estimated that between 1.5 and 2 million Russians emigrated after the revolution and civil war. And of course, they were distributed around the world. Many escaped into China and then went to Japan, then from there down to in the war or before the war to Australia. Most to Western Europe, of course, and primarily to Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, countries, Czechoslovakia and France, where they were welcomed. After all, Russia, Imperial Russia, had been the Western powers' ally. The Western powers had sent not very adequate military supplies and reinforcements to help the white armies. And so probably there was a certain amount of guilt that they welcomed the whites and and obviously too feared the plotting of the Soviet Union. Now, the interesting part of Stalin's career for me is less his ultimate success when the tide of war turned against Hitler, and finally when Stalin ruled as a complete despot over the Soviet Union until he died in 1953. But the period leading up to the war. Now, what we all used to be told, and what I fear many people still believe, is that is the story that when Stalin, Molotov and Ribbentrop signed the pact in 1939 between the Soviet Union and Germany, that they were a pact of neutrality, and which, in a secret protocol, divided up Eastern Europe between the two dictatorships. It's very widely, it was claimed in the Soviet Union that this was merely buying time so that Stalin could prepare himself for the inevitable war that would come. Well, actually, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Initially, Stalin had every reason to dislike what Hitler stood for. Hitler was fanatically anti-communist, but I think only because he saw them as rivals aiming at the same goal, despotic power in his case in Germany. Stalin first of all looked on Hitler as a dangerous enemy, but then began to realize that he was actually, when he became Chancellor in 1933 and Germany began rearming, that he was actually a very dangerous potential adversary. And as early as 1934, he sent his brother-in-law, David Kandelaki, to Berlin to sound out the German government whether they would enter into any sort of friendly relations with the Soviet Union. Hitler wasn't ready for that yet. There was still his propaganda war against the communists. And in the following year came, in Germany, the famous or infamous Night of the Long Knives, which one of my first books I wrote about that, was when Hitler decided to dispose of inconvenient rivals. No one was actually threatening him. His position was very strong. But he had gathered, I think they numbered altogether about 1 million of the brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung, who supported the Nazis in breaking up, smashing up Jewish shops or breaking up communist gatherings and that sort of thing. And he had decided now that they were disposable. He now needed the goodwill of the German army. The brown shirts were brutal and cruel, but pretty useless militarily. So he had the leading brown shirts, Ernst Röhm and his fellows, as well as a number of other people that he thought were challenging his authority, murdered all in one night on June the 30th, 1934. Now, I mentioned this because it was also important in the Soviet Union, because Stalin called a meeting of the Politburo and said, this shows that Hitler is a man to be reckoned with and to be admired, and that he had learned Stalin's own lesson that you kill your enemies before they can kill you. And thereafter, his efforts to come to some sort of deal with Hitler increased. But Hitler himself was, for quite a while, not interested. His ambitions, of course, were at the time the Anschluss with Austria, then finally the siege of Sudetenland, and then last, well, not quite last, but I mean at that in peacetime, the siege of the whole of Czechoslovakia. The Western Britain and France wished that the Soviet Union would become involved. But not only had Stalin no intention of becoming involved, the Red Army was in a powerless state, largely thanks to Stalin himself and the infamous, notorious 1937 purge, when he purged the Red Army of most of its ablest officers, the leading light among whom was Marshal Tukhachevsky, who had all but seized Warsaw during the 1920. And who, 1921, I think, yes. And Tukhachevsky was a brutal, cruel man who, for instance, used poison gas in putting down the uprising of peasants in Tambov province. But he was extremely talented, and above all, he realized that the next war would not, as the existing chief of the Soviet General Staff, Voroshilov, thought, be won by masses of cavalry, but that armor would play the key part in the war that was to come. And by disposing of Tukhachevsky, of course, Stalin also disposed of any real gearing up of the Red Army to be in a position to take on the Wehrmacht. So Stalin was prepared to make almost any concession. And finally, Hitler saw that it was to his advantage, that for the moment at any rate, to come to some sort of deal with Stalin. So he sent his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to Moscow, and there Ribbentrop received a hero's welcome. The swastika and the hammer and sickle hung on flags throughout the streets. There was great bonhomie among them. And when Ribbentrop returned to Berlin, he said, I don't know why we've been so hostile to the communists. I've seen them now, and they're just lads like our brown shirts. There was actually, I would say, awfully little to choose between Hitler and Stalin. Stalin in the end won, but he won only by the skin of his teeth. Not only had he decimated the best part of the Red Army so that it was in no position to meet the onslaught of the Wehrmacht, but he'd ruined the Soviet economy, and the last thing he wanted or could afford was war. So they came to the deal that divided up Eastern Europe, as we know, whereby Hitler acquired most of Poland and Stalin acquired the Baltic states. Finland was on the list, but Finland wasn't yet to be taken. Too tough. Half of Poland and a big chunk of Romania, and this was the deal between them. And Stalin was very pleased with the deal because he actually feared. And that's the extraordinary thing as we look back in hindsight. He feared the British and the French far more. He seemed to them, they were far more powerful. They both have their huge worldwide empires. If you looked at the map, half the world seemed to be either British or French. That they would have resources which the Soviet Union could never match. I mean, after all, then in the Far East, he had to worry about Japan. They'd already been to war with Japan. British India, of course, which was had on the face of it a very large army. Everything appeared to threaten him, and so he looked upon Hitler at this during the nearly 2 years that they were allies, as his savior and protector against any danger arriving from the West. As I say, chiefly the British and the French. And the aid he gave, when we're told that he was preparing for war, he virtually saved Hitler's bacon. Part of the agreement was economic, and colossal amounts of raw materials were shipped from the Soviet Union to feed the German war machine. And so when we were being bombed in 1940, the nitroglycerine and cupronickel that made the bombs and the petroleum which flew the planes virtually all came from the Soviet Union. Trains, one thing about Stalin was that he was absolutely punctilious in delivering everything. Also, he included vast quantities of grain, and as long as the Soviet Union was hostile to Germany, of course there was no prospect. But now the Soviet Union acted as his sort of commissariat. More than that, the Germans were allowed to build a naval base near Murmansk on Soviet soil. And from it, they said, for example, Soviet icebreakers cleared a way for a German cruiser to go right round the north of Siberia and enter into the Pacific, where it sank about 64,000 tons of Allied shipping. It was a real alliance, and I think it should never be forgotten that Hitler and Stalin were allies. And what's more, the alliance was not broken off by Stalin, and nor was Stalin willing for it to be broken off. As time grew closer to Hitler's ambitions moving eastwards, in the beginning of 1941, he launched lightning strikes against the Balkans, occupied the whole of the Balkans. Half of Poland was his already. And it should have been obvious to anyone that the next on the target would be to drive east, as indeed in Mein Kampf and in his earlier guise as anti-communist leader, he had repeatedly said that is where we will occupy the whole of that huge breadbasket in the Ukraine, and the frontier of the Greater Reich will be on the Urals, and will drive the Russians, primitive people, far away into Siberia, where they'll be forgotten forever. Stalin was warned, this is better known, was warned of Hitler's intentions. He moved eventually in the spring of 1941, when the Yugoslavia collapsed, Greece was occupied, Bulgaria and Romania were sympathetic to the Germans, and he moved some 680,000 troops up to the frontier, something which of course would be very hard to miss. His own spies were telling him what was happening. The famous spy in Japan, Richard Sorga, was sending reports which he'd got from the Japanese that Hitler was planning war. British intelligence in the previous year had already begun to get a sniff of it and told Stalin, obviously it was in British interest, that Stalin and Hitler should go to war with each other. And his own agents were reporting it. Even German aeroplanes began flying over Soviet airspace for taking photographs. One plane was grounded, and they found in it maps of Soviet aerodromes. And finally, on the very day, the 22nd of June, when Operation Barbarossa began, Stalin got reports from people actually on the front. And for instance, when Sevastopol was shelled that morning by the German Navy, and the commander, the military commander, rang Stalin and said, "But the Germans are shelling us." And Stalin told him to shut up, or otherwise he'd be shot. So he himself brought the disaster which followed, both by the military purges which led up to Soviet Russia's weakness, and then by giving Hitler everything he wanted, and finally by ignoring all the reports. It was again claimed that the occupying of eastern Poland puts Soviet Russia in a stronger position by extending their frontier westwards. Well, it didn't. It took 3 weeks for the Wehrmacht to cross occupied Poland and plunge deep into the Soviet Union. All these things Stalin was responsible for. Then, of course, we know how the tide of war continued. The big disaster, of course, from Hitler's point of view was, but he was sort of a real fanatic with his racial theories, weird historical theories. Rather like Stalin, he was governed by simplistic views of history, which are very dangerous. Better to know no history at all, I sometimes think. In fact, when I read in the papers that a politician or journalist is saying, "History tells us," you can be almost certain it doesn't. Then of course, the biggest mistake Hitler made in the whole of the war, I would say arguably, is that he made no attempt, as many of his own senior officers were urging, to raise up the Russian people against their oppressors, and to declare war for a free Russia, which then may have made peace. But Hitler, of course, wasn't that sort of person. He couldn't do that. He thought they must be bludgeoned into the ground. In that way, he was just like Stalin. And he had sometimes certain great successes were against his wishes or unbeknownst to him, or in the as the tide was turning against him, he tacitly let it go ahead, that quantities of Russian troops surrendered to the Germans. Many, of course, involuntarily. They were caught up behind the lines or had to surrender and so on. But many voluntarily went over to the German army. Initially, too, the Germans appeared as liberators. First, for a start, all Russians had read in Russian Soviet newspapers from August 1939 until June 1941 was praise of Germany, the great nation that was fighting against the imperialist, capitalist countries like France and Britain. And then suddenly the Germans, who've been praised up to the skies, appear on their doorsteps, said, your churches will be opened again, clearing out Soviet concentration camps and so forth. And if Stalin had played the Russian card, so to speak, I think it's arguable that he could have won the war without much difficulty. But instead, of course, what happened too, for instance, in the Don territory, where the Cossacks in particular welcomed the Germans as liberators, then, as the tide of war shifted here and there, news came of just how the SS troops in particular were treating ordinary Russians, and I think the view swiftly changed to, well, better our own dictator than an enemy one, a foreign one. And so eventually, thanks to the resilience and fighting qualities of the Russian people, but no thanks to Stalin, we emerged victorious. Well, that's much of what I've said I expect was known to you already, but I thought it's better to introduce it. But I hope that if anyone has any questions on very specific things, or anything really.
You mentioned that it was in Britain's interests for Germany and Russia to cancel each other out, as it were. Could you elucidate a bit more on those lines?
Well, many statesmen, I think it was Truman, looking across to America, who said that the best outcome of all this would be if Nazi Germany and Communist Russia destroyed each other. And of course, but on a more realistic level, the more Germany, and as events turned out, the more the German army, German armed services became involved in this gigantic conflict in the East, the less likely they would be able to maintain their position in Western Europe, and eventually, of course, allow us to bring the fight back to them. So from our point of view, of course, it was when the news reached Britain, when Anthony Eden, who was Foreign Secretary, was told the next day that the Germans had invaded. Oh no, sorry, I was thinking of an earlier episode. Yes, so it was very much in Britain's interest. And of course, having been a boy in Britain at that time, I remember how people suddenly became mad keen on Stalin. But I think, to me, I'm no great lover of Stalin. It's understandable and excusable at this time when the war, everything looked very dark, and it seemed, and then of course it seemed, we got so much propaganda during the war, and it was really, we all know George Orwell, for instance, even when the war was over, could hardly find a publisher to take Animal Farm because it was reflecting on our great Soviet ally. Whether one could have adopted a more realistic attitude and said, well, they're barbarians, but they're our barbarians, I think probably it'd be hard to argue that, really. We needed, well, first of all, it would need a lot of hindsight that we were going to win. And secondly, in the circumstances of the time, I can't see Churchill, well, he said I would, someone said to him, would you really like the Soviets? He said, I'd put in a good word for the devil if he'd come in on our side. Which is more or less what happened, of course. I think the big mistake was not then, but when the war ended, that we weren't more prepared for a brutal and aggressive Soviet Union. The propaganda had made it so difficult to change people's views.
I've just been reading your magnificent book, which really is brilliant, Stalin's Secret War, especially given that it was written before the archives were opened up. I've got one or two questions, and you might want to interrupt me because I'm going on too long, but they're all questions. The first is, you mentioned that Stalin was anointed by Lenin. I have read that Lenin criticized Stalin before he died and said that this is a man who's too cruel and he shouldn't take over the Soviet Union. Of course, coming from a cruel tyrant himself, this seems a little bit anomalous. And is it not true that Stalin's secretary gerrymandered the ballot amongst the cognoscenti, which therefore chose Stalin instead of perhaps Trotsky?
Well, Lenin's, as I mentioned earlier, Lenin's criticism of Stalin was quite muted, and I mean, it's called his testament, as if it was his final word on everything. But really, it's quite, when one considers what sort of a man Stalin was and what he'd already shown himself to be. But I always remember Robert Conquest quotes when, in later years, when Molotov Stalin's foreign minister, was in old age, but long after Stalin's death, and said, and he'd also been a minister under Lenin, and was the only person who survived who had seen both, and said, who do you think, how would you compare Stalin with Lenin? And Molotov thought, and he said, well, Lenin was more cruel. And there's a lot in that, not by the number of victims, where clearly Stalin outclassed more or less everyone except Chairman Mao, but the cruelty of his nature. I think if you read Lenin's correspondence, it's really the sort of ravings of a sadist, I would say.
Do you think that Stalin was the anointed successor, therefore, of Lenin?
Very hard to say, because of course Lenin had suffered a series of strokes, and which were kept secret at first from the Soviet public. So how far Lenin, and there are photographs of him just looking completely gaga and being pushed around in a wheelchair. So I don't think, I don't recall that at any time that sort of Lenin made a formal handover to Stalin, and but Stalin made himself invaluable. He was very ingratiating. And then, of course, there was, for some time, the question whether it should be he or Trotsky who succeeded. So it was far from clear initially.
The other question is, to what extent do you think the West built up Stalin's industry? A huge amount of technology in the first 5-year plan, for instance, was conveyed across to Russia, and it built up a large degree of Russian industrial strength, and yet the West seemed to do nothing when that occurred, and I just wondered whether you might reflect on that.
Do you mean material brought from the West?
In technology, primarily.
Yes, the engineers and so on. Yes, who were many of them subsequently discovered by Stalin to be plotters and executed. Well, there was a lot of gullibility in this respect, and Lloyd George switched the policy of intervening to help the whites. When it was clear that the whites were not going to win, he then said, well, we've got to deal with these people, and made trade deals and so on, probably far in excess of what was beneficial to the particular industries, but not beneficial to Britain or the West's interests. And Lenin famously said that the West will give us the rope, sell us the rope to let us hang them. So they were really much more pragmatic, I would say, than we were. Lloyd George has quite a lot to answer for, I think, in that respect.
Okay, the third question, if I'm allowed a third one, relates really to the war between Germany and Russia, Operation Barbarossa. A number of Russian authors, more recently, probably since the archives were made available, have suggested that Russia was about to attack Germany. And it seems strange, if that wasn't the case, that there was so many parachute troops massed on the German, Russian and Polish border against Germany, perhaps up to 500,000 of them, given that these can only be used for aggressive and not for defensive purposes. I forget the name of the
Well, Alexander Suvorov wrote a book, Icebreaker, one of the books, but I know other books have been written too.
And related to that, I think a number of historians have suggested that Russia, even when it was winning the war against Germany, made an attempt to have peace with Germany, presumably so that the Germans would set themselves against the West, which would weaken both Germany and the West, which will allow Stalin to be even more powerful.
Personally, I don't believe at all the theory that, which is very convenient, of course, for Stalin's memory, that the Soviet Union was actually planning and had in quite an advanced state forces ready to attack Germany. Well, where were all these forces when June the 22nd? The whole front just collapsed under half the Soviet Air Force was knocked out by the Luftwaffe. It was chaotic. I mean, for thousands and thousands of well-trained NKVD troops were too busy transporting prisoners from gulag camps and jails into the interior to be able to stand and fight the Germans. There was no evidence. There'd been no attempt to erect fortifications in the land that was occupied. It was just, I think Stalin just looked at the map and saw it does look nice if your frontier is that much further. But nothing had actually happened, because as I say, surely the proof of the pudding is in the eating, that none of these paratroops and the rest of them actually appeared. There was initially, it seemed like a pushover. Hitler said, you'll see, we'll kick the door in and the whole house will collapse. So, but of course it's, it's difficult to prove, I suppose, one way or the other. There were, I think the Soviets boasted they had 3 million men under arms, so there were obviously, on the Western Front, there were going to be a lot of soldiers, but there was no, because he was, I mean, again, if that was the case, why didn't Stalin, the moment he learned of the first German operations, why didn't he lift his telephone and put all this mighty army into position? But he didn't, he couldn't. And there were even, momentary attempts on Stalin's part at peace feelers during the early weeks. So none of it really. Then I think all the apologies for the pact really get nowhere. But there's a lot more information coming out, and I should say I've got a good friend, American Professor Sean McMeekin, who's I say quite a bit of him, and he is writing a book. He's written what I would say is at the moment, the best history of the Russian Revolution, and it in particular shows the extent, far beyond what we knew before, the extent to which the Germans financed the Bolshevik coup in 1917. And it was, of course, very much in the Germany's interests to get Russia out of the war, which she was successful in doing. So, but obviously more is coming out in the Russian archives. But I can't see that it would really overturn these, what philosophers call brute facts.
Something that has puzzled me and continues to puzzle me is the following circumstance. Stalin, for sure, was the shrewdest man in the Soviet Union to have survived and annihilated all his opponents. With that shrewdness, and with all the forewarnings by brilliant agents like Sorge, the ambassador in Istanbul, how come that shrewd man did not react to the obvious that Germany was attacking Russia? It's hard to explain.
His shrewdness was of a certain type, I think, which could be self-destructive. I think he didn't have I wouldn't have thought a broad vision. The tyranny and oppression of the Soviet Union was the number one thing for him. The internal enemy was the enemy he really feared, which is in a way it's a projection of that, why he feared to an extent which still historians haven't come to terms with. He feared the whites because they were Russian. And actually there's an interesting illustration of that. When I was writing my book, Victims of Yalta, I interviewed a former Red Army soldier who defected and was living in London. And he was there on June the 22nd at the frontier, and he said the first thing we knew was that officers that we had in Red Army uniform that we hadn't seen before ordered us to go that way and that way the other, but always away from the Germans. And actually it turned out that they were Russian emigre officers of the Imperial Army who'd been parachuted in by the Germans, and as General Krasnov in his novels describes, which you'd think might be just romance, that they bore such authority that the Red Army rank and file obeyed them. And then, of course, we know that later then Stalin realized that when he introduced epaulets, which had been abolished at the revolution, and the orders of Suvorov and Kutuzov, what the Russians needed was their glorious imperial history, which was what he looked to, and in a way, I mean, it was part of what worked to win the war. So I think he was shrewd and cunning, but with the cunning Parker, Bernard Shaw, the cunning of a gangster on a colossal scale. I mean, because so much of what he did was self-destructive. I mean, in particular, purging people who committed no crime, but the worst purge of all from his point of view, the purge of the army in 1937. I mean, the army was in the 1930s, the Red Army was looked upon as derisory as a military force by the Western powers. Yet we all know that Russia throughout modern history has produced incredible armies and won incredible victories. So I think his shrewdness had its severe restrictions of his bizarre psychology.
Do you think it would be helpful if there was a more objective appraisal of Stalin within Russia today? And do you think it's realistic to expect that there will be one?
It's a very, very interesting question, that, yes, because whenever I go to Russia, I'm always, my first port of call is bookshops, but to see what new works have come out and fascinating revelations. Well, I'm not really in a position to judge, obviously, about what Russian public opinion is, but my own subjective impression is that there's some, and always has been, some sort of nostalgic patriotic pride in the victories of the Red Army, and which of course we perfectly understand, indeed support. But I personally find no difficulty in distinguishing that from Stalin, who betrayed so many of them. Not only had he betrayed those who actually killed in battle owing to his purges and incompetence, but those who surrendered and who were given the order that you keep your last bullet to shoot yourself. You're not allowed to surrender, which the consequence of that was that the Germans were able to raise a sort of, inverted quotes, army of General Vlasov of something like, I think it was 800,000 people. In the Great War, the Germans had gone around prisoner of war camps trying to persuade Russians to join them. And in the end, I think 21 people volunteered.
Nikolai.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this excellent talk. You'll be familiar with Montefiore's observation that it was the work of Darwin that was read by the young monk Stalin in the seminary, and it was, according to Sebag Montefiore, it was that book that made this young man throw off his robe to say, if this book is true, there is no God. Now, first of all, do we assume that that is a correct version? I've only read it in that one book. If it is so, what would have happened if Darwin had never written a bloody book?
Well, to answer the last question first, I think there's no doubt that people of that sort of criminal mentality will always find some legitimizing factor. Of course, Darwin's misreadings of Darwin have justified all sorts of things, very unpleasant things. And I mean, and Hitler himself also had an admiration for what one might call the pseudo-Darwin, which has nothing to do with the real Darwin. And I think that much of Soviet thinking was a search for legitimation of what was actually a gangster state. But very few people, even the gangsters, wished to be thought of as gangsters. And so much of this, but also human nature, they wanted to hide it from themselves. So they needed this simplistic ideology. Well, of course, to the extent that Darwin influenced Karl Marx, and Karl Marx, of course, had a colossal influence, because Karl Marx wrote, I think he's been hugely overrated as a thinker, let alone what the consequences of his thinking were. He saw all of history as a simplistic succession of thesis, antithesis, and moving forward. Of course, history doesn't operate in that neat and nicely docketed way. But I'm not sure that how true that story is, which Sebag Montefiore tells. It's true, of course. He wasn't a monk, but he was in a seminary. And it was a sort of light-hearted aspect of it is that Stalin was not a great orator. I think by their standards, Trotsky and Lenin were good at speaking to crowds. Stalin was not. That he did become an atheist there. And I think that atheism was necessary. Of course, you can hardly, if you really believe in the Bible, commit crimes of well, we hope not one murder, but let alone murders of millions, which gave him seemingly no remorse at any stage. Though his daughter told me she was amused to see that at his funeral there were a large number of bishops and clergy present. But I don't know whether Stalin himself would have approved.
Is the point that I was under the impression that he'd actually organised for them to be there, or there was someone else who brought them?
Well, it might have been. I mean, yes, I think it's quite possible. And he didn't quite like the Emperor Charles V rehearse his own funeral, but it's a sort of thing that he would have done. Everything that happened in the Soviet Union had to have, theoretically, his approval. So it would be strange if he hadn't. I think he feared death. But he feared people around him, and he did live. I mean, there was sort of tiny compensation for the reign of terror he brought on Russia is what he brought on himself, because I've described in my book, and one could write more now, the amazing precautions taken, and that he had, like medieval kings, had a food taster, but every bit of food had to be tasted by someone, and Stalin would look at him to see if he was getting a bit pale or whatever. The food actually came from special farms where they were guarded by the NKVD to make sure nothing happened to it before it even set off. Every bit of food that was served was wrapped in a sealed package and had to be unsealed in the presence of senior NKVD officers. And one, which was accidentally, the seal was cracked, and I think it was a woman NKVD officer was looking at it, she was immediately sent to a gulag camp. So he lived sweating with fear that sooner or later, I mean, it was a very reasonable fear. Hardly a person in the Soviet Union who hadn't lost someone, a wife, children, or whatever. All his leading officers, Molotov praised Stalin for sending Molotov's wife to a gulag camp. Said she must have been a traitor.
You said just now that you regarded Russia as a gangster state under Stalin. Do you think much has changed?
Oh, well, yes, and that relates to an earlier question, which I didn't answer properly, I think. I think a lot has changed. I went to the Soviet Union, I'm glad I did, to see what it was like in 1968, when there wasn't a reign of terror anymore like under Stalin, but still it was incredibly oppressive. And I'm glad I did, because there's just, I would say, no comparison. I mean, all I saw, obviously, was I went to the Baltic states and Petersburg and Moscow, so I can hardly pose as an authority. But it was grim then, and now I think I don't think it's a totalitarian state in any way, in the sense that any dissident opinion is forbidden, or that every step you take is watched, every aspect of the economy is is monitored by the state. So things have changed, but there's, of course, we've inherited an awful lot from that. There's what some people in Russia call the 70 wasted years, and including appalling corruption. I mean, that's not a new thing. That nothing could be more corrupt than the Soviet Union, or indeed most dictatorships obviously invite corruption, because there's no outward examination or indeed anything to fear by being corrupt. Unfortunately, that corruption obviously goes on. We can see that the government often acts in an oppressive or a tyrannical way towards individuals. But on the other hand, books can be published where you're saying, what's the attitude towards Stalin? Well, I'd say it's very mixed. I'm judging by the books that are published. The important books are those which, like, for instance, to give one example, I remember when the Katyn massacre, which both the British and American governments said was perpetrated by the Germans, as was made out during the war, whereas in fact all the evidence was pointing to the Soviets, forensic evidence. And the Foreign Office was still insisting that it was the Germans who did it, when the Russian government published, I've got it at home, all the documents from Stalin signing the order down to the NKVD murderers on the spot, which showed without the slightest question who was responsible. But that was published as an official. And it's one of a series too of publishing other ones. I've got about 4 of them. One is about the banished, when 1922, Lenin banished most of the leading intellectuals from Russia who had any sort of different opinion from his. And then there's others on the slaughter of the kulaks and the forced famine. So these books, the truth is coming out, and I think if the truth can and does come out, it's a very potent weapon. It's very difficult to maintain in an argument that these things didn't happen when the evidence is made public for the very first time. So, and a lot of these books are not published or translated. Some are, but not translated in the West. So I think we get a slightly false impression of history, for example, being heavily doctored in Russia. I don't think it is being heavily doctored, otherwise it would be impossible to walk into an ordinary bookshop and get this evidence. Well, my friend, another Russian friend who works at the Stanford University recently gave me a marvelous encyclopedic book of the history of the officers of the Vlasov army, the army which the Germans raised theoretically to fight against the Soviets. It's an extraordinary work of scholarship, but perhaps the most encouraging thing is the foreword, where he, in scholarly terms and quoting from international law, said that these people, that anyone in Russia was perfectly entitled. They had a government which had no respect for any human rights or any liberty, and in that case that legitimates any form of resistance. So, and that book is published. It's by far and away the best book on the subject, and there are plenty of others because I'm always keeping an eye out for them. So I think, I hope, it doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, Imperial Russia was moving gradually towards, generally I would say, improving up to the eve of the revolution, with setbacks, of course, whereas everything in the Soviet Union then sort of ossified terror. Now we can't tell what would happen, but I can't, it's just a subjective opinion, I cannot see anything like Stalinism or what's now happening in China returning to Russia. It may have bad turns, may have good turns, but it seems to me that the totalitarian era for Russia seems to be over, I hope.
I have a question on the non-aggression pact that was discussed earlier. You mentioned that Britain for a while had stopped supporting the whites. Weren't there discussions between Britain, France or the US to establish some form of pact against Germany before Stalin went on and signed the non-aggression pact with Germany? Do you know if there was any offers or rebuffals for both sides?
There were Britain and France, of course, as from 1934 onwards, 36, 37, were very keen to get the Soviet Union to intervene and restore the balance. And one can understand it, because Germany sits there in the heart of Europe, heavily armed, far more formidable in every possible way than the Soviet Union in purely practical terms. So it would have been in their interest if they could have got the Soviet Union to intervene. But at the Munich, I think, yes, at the Munich conference, there's a famous cartoon by David Lowe, the cartoonist, and he shows Chamberlain and Daladier for Britain and France, and Mussolini, and I forget another statesman, at Munich. And then there's a figure of Stalin, 5'2" in real life, as a sort of looming giant, say, "Haven't you got a chair for me?" Well, they would have liked him there, but there was no way in which, to Stalin's great relief, that he could have intervened, because in order to intervene in Czechoslovakia, which is what was the issue, they'd have had to, this Red Army would have had to have crossed 100 miles of Polish and Romanian territory. And the Poles and Romanians, with very good reason, were absolutely terrified, horrified at the thought of the Red Army entering them. It was most people thought that it would be worse than the Wehrmacht, because there was no reason to believe in the barbarities which were inflicted, or to anticipate the barbarities inflicted by the German army in occupied Eastern Europe at that stage. So the Germans appeared the more civilized, but at the same time the more threatening.
Fascinating topic, and I guess one that historically has affected everyone in this room some way. You don't have to look too far back in your family. So with that, I'd say a very big thank you to Nikolai for coming and being very generous with his time and all his work and sharing it with the group. And thank you all for coming. And one last thing I'd just say, for the Romanoff Foundation, we're very happy to produce these events and put them together. We greatly appreciate any donations you can have, either bank transfer if you want to get in touch with me. We have some gift aid envelopes here as well, if anybody would like to fill those in. And that will help us to do more of these, and I could definitely feel a part 2 seems to be needed given the topic. So again, thank you very much, Nikolai.